you have a book about the new Apostolic Reformation coming out, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later. But can you explain to somebody who has never heard of it what NAR is?
Yeah, so the New Apostolic Reformation, the phrase was coined in 1996, and it centers around the work of a seminary professor named C. Peter Wagner, who was at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California for about 30 years. And Wagner was an expert in church growth who believed that the non-denominational charismatic sector of Christianity. So these are churches or ministries that are not associated with a denomination and that are charismatic in the sense of they are trying to restore the supernatural dimensions of early Christianity. That's kind of a rough definition of charismatic. And that sector was going to be really the space for the future growth of global Christianity. And Wagner really became immersed in that world. And there were ideas already floating around that world about the renewed ministry of apostles and prophets who would transform the global church in the 20th century. And Wagner kind of grabbed hold of those ideas, became a very strong believer in those ideas, and coined this term, or developed this term, New Apostolic Reformation, to try to describe his understanding, his version of this kind of global movement of led by apostles and prophets who would transform the global church and ultimately transform the world. Wagner was also very invested in a set of practices and paradigms around what's popularly called spiritual warfare, and this idea that there are demons and angels battling over the world. Many Christians believe in spiritual warfare, but Wagner and his colleagues developed a very aggressive version of spiritual warfare that Wagner called strategic level spiritual warfare. And this is the idea that these same apostles and prophets are generals of spiritual warfare who can orchestrate campaigns of spiritual warfare. And Wagner helped develop this a concept called territorial spirits. The idea is, so most people who talk about spiritual warfare think about it in terms of, there are demons that are oppressing me, or there are demons that are going after my community. We need to pray against those demons, or we need to do spiritual practices to prevent this kind of demonic attack. But Wagner believed that he believed in all of that, but then he said there's a whole other level at which this is operating. There are hierarchies of demons, and the highest levels of demons, what he interpreted from the Bible, these phrases in the book of Ephesians about principalities and powers, he called those territorial spirits who rule over literal physical territory and human institutions and are entrenched in power. And then he believed that you could mobilize, using these apostles and prophets, mobilize campaigns of spiritual warfare to displace those territorial spirits and conquer spiritual territory, which actually maps onto literal territory, and then reform nations through that. And this became a very influential movement in that independent charismatic space that didn't have a lot of institutions because it's non-denominational. So the NAR became a central set of leadership networks in the independent charismatic space, with at its peak under Wagner, probably about 1,000 leaders who were involved in these networks that he created. And he retired from Fuller Seminary in 1999 to really work full-time on building this New Apostolic Reformation concept that he'd come up with a few years earlier, and really enlisted his inner circle of friends and mentees in helping to do that work.